Christ. Oh. This might be the biggest and is definitely the heaviest headphone amplifier that I've reviewed. I'm GoldenSound, you're watching the Headphone Show by Headphones.com, and this is the Luxman P-100 Centennial. A headphone amplifier that Luxman is releasing to celebrate their 100th anniversary, and you might think from the sheer size of it that this is a speaker amp that happens to have a headphone out, but no, this is indeed a dedicated headphone amplifier, a particularly powerful one, and a particularly expensive one. But the kind of person that is not worried about spending $12,000 on a headphone amplifier, although it may be more by the time this video goes out because tariffs are fun, hey, is probably not going to be too worried about spending a few $100s on a rack, and they're likely to need to because this weighs around 45 pounds or 20 kilograms. Why does it weigh so much? Well, besides being the heaviest amp I've reviewed, it's quite possibly the amp with the best build quality of anything I've reviewed. The front is a matte silver with the main body being brushed aluminium, and on every last inch of this, the finishing is impeccable. The engravings, the badge, the sharp edges leading into smooth contours around the buttons and connections, it's just pristine. And internally, this is far from an empty box. There is a lot going on in here. It's quite a busy design, but it's also a very tidy design. Cable routing is great. There are big copper buses in place of PCBs or basic soldering in some spots. They're using all of their own branded capacitors, and even if you look closely at the PCBs, you'll see that all of the traces are curved. Luxman intentionally avoids having any kind of sharp traces on their PCBs, which shouldn't have any effect for things close to audio frequencies, but this approach can actually have an impact for really high frequency RF stuff. Regardless, seeing Luxman putting quite a significant amount of extra work into making every trace throughout this quite complex design curved rather than angled is just nice to see. There are other niceties too, such as the sheer heft of the cover or the pads that ensure that there is a softer contact between it and the main unit. Though one thing I was a little bit disappointed by was the fact that this unit doesn't appear to have a mains ground connection, which is a possible safety concern but also can have an impact on the performance of a device in certain situations. I'd definitely have preferred to see a ground with an optional lift switch or something rather than just not having one. The front offers a range of inputs and controls, including selectable inputs, outputs, gain, left-right balance, and the option to enable or disable GDIV mode, which effectively makes the balanced output of this amplifier run as single-ended, and as we'll see shortly, the behavior is fairly different. Those controls also, again, just feel fantastic. The left-right balance, for example, moves smoothly with a nice amount of resistance, but then has a firm lock in the center with absolutely no play to it. Same as the buttons, firm and short travel distance with basically no wiggling at all. The volume knob itself is particularly good in terms of knob feel. The resistance sort of changes depending on how fast you move it, with lower resistance when turning slowly and more resistance when moving it fast. And the volume steps themselves also move dependent on the speed you turn the knob, moving much faster when you want, but slowing down massively when you want to make smaller adjustments, which does make fine-tuning the volume on this remarkably easy. The one output that you might be a little confused by is the BTL output, which is a single XLR3 output. That is so that if you really like spending money, you can buy two of these amplifiers and run them in dual mono, one amp for the left channel, one amp for the right channel. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to test that because I don't actually have any XLR female-to-female adapters, so sorry to the two people that wanted to do that. I'm being a little jokey because this amp is crazy. It is huge, it is heavy, it just kind of ignores any of the typical convenience factors that you would usually get with headphones. But for the kind of person that is willing to put a lot of money into their headphone setup and just wants the best possible sounding result, convenience be damned, does this give you that? Well, it certainly gives you a lot of power. The specs claim 4 watts at 32 ohms, but I measured closer to 15 watts. Nice to see that they're being conservative, but safe to say this will run anything you might want to throw at it. Objectively speaking, it does pretty well too, with distortion and noise falling around minus 105 dB with a 4-volt output, and only changing slightly when putting on a more difficult 32 ohm load. Distortion versus frequency is pretty flat, with only a slight bump up towards 20 kHz. Distortion versus output power is pretty consistent up until a few hundred milliwatts at 32 ohms. It does start rising if you really crank it higher than that though. Go and watch our Do I Need an Amplifier video to know how much power you actually need from your amplifier and whether an overpowered amp is actually a good or bad thing. It's overall a pretty objectively well-performing unit, at least from the balanced output. If you use the single-ended output or put it in GDIV mode, which basically makes it run single-ended from the balanced output, then distortion does increase a fair bit, though it's a very even order dominated profile and resembles the sort of result you'd get when looking at a single-ended triode tube amp. So this is a nice option to have if you do want a notably warmer sound at the touch of a button. So the sound and objective performance of this amp does change a fair bit depending on if you use single-ended or balanced output, and it's nice to have that option at the press of a button if you have a balanced headphone, but for those that only have a single-ended connection on their headphone, it's a bit of a shame that you can't get the what I think is higher performance result from the balanced output. Anyway, enough about the build. How does it sound? Well, this amp takes a slightly more laid-back approach. It's not what I'd call a warm amplifier overall. Something like a chord alto from an overall tonal perspective is definitely warmer than this, and the Luxman falls closer to the HM1 in zero feedback mode. But it does have a slightly rounded off presentation. The mid-range specifically on this amplifier is absolutely stunning. For both male and female vocals, they're still quite timbrally accurate, but just a bit more textured and intimate sounding than on most other amplifiers. In fact, I would go as far as to say that for vocal representation specifically, I prefer this amp to the Mascobo 465. Playing something like Only Girl in the Room by Isila was outright more enjoyable on this than on the HM1, 465, or any of the other amplifiers I have here, but that is a very vocal-focused and slightly more legato song as a whole. As you start to listen a bit more either side of the mids, that's when things start to change. This is, as mentioned, a fairly laid-back sounding amplifier, and if you listen to genres or music that benefits from a more punchy, impactful sounding presentation, that's where this is lacking a bit. Comparing the P-100 to the Hollow Bliss with some overflow by Reed Willis, those heavy drums just hit harder on the Bliss than on the Luxman. The Luxman felt like it was holding things back slightly, with the Bliss being more immediate. Just slightly. This is not a pillowy sounding amp or anything, it's just that it definitely does not quite have the same level of macrodynamic impact as many others. But then when at about 3 minutes into that song, the strings start coming in, that textured richness and just fantastic mid-range again, which the Bliss already does really well. That's one of the standout points of that amplifier. On this, it's just particularly smile-inducing. The slight roundedness to the bass presentation on the P-100 luckily doesn't seem to impact the separation or clarity when tracks get either bassier or busier overall. Saturnine by Go-Go Penguin has quite a lot of low-frequency elements going on all at once, and you can still pick out and focus on any one thing without any kind of smearing or congestion just as easily on this as you can on the HM1. But it's when a track gets really slammy and benefits from that fast impact that this does just start to fall back a bit. Another Reed Willis track, Dog Bates Man, is a particularly good track for testing bass impact overall, and it's just not as forceful or fun on the P-100 as it is on the Bliss, the HM1, the Mascobo 465, or the OR. Part of this slightly laid-back presentation also comes from the way that the Luxman presents treble. It's just not quite as incisive or outright detailed as many other options, including at far lower prices. When listening to Best Behavior by Mansionaire, there is a distinct difference in the openness and upper treble air between the Luxman and the HM1. The Luxman is a bit denser, more intimate, a little smoother, and the vocals still sound fantastic, and again, I would perhaps say I slightly prefer the vocal presentation here, but the level of actual information available is a step down, and things do also have a little bit less of an expansive spatial presentation overall. This amplifier does synergize particularly well with headphones like the Sennheiser HD800S that can definitely use a little bit more of a laid-back sound to tame some of their inherent brightness. But then with the Hi-Fi-Man Susvara, be it the OG or the Unveiled, it worked quite well for most aspects. The Susvara is a little bit prone to getting somewhat limp sounding if you don't run it on something which has a fairly dynamic sound to it inherently, as well as just being able to power them properly. The OG is pretty power hungry. And so on this, I just found that it was lacking a kind of engagement. They just felt a little bit too soft and held back, and just not all that fun. So I didn't really find myself reaching for those too much. The two headphones that I did find myself reaching for quite a lot with this amplifier were the Abyss 1266 and the Austrian Audio Composer. They were probably two of my favorites on this. Those seem to play really nicely, and as both inherently very dynamic sounding headphones that can also both use a little bit of help to calm down their treble, the result with this amplifier was extremely enjoyable. This is a pretty interesting amplifier. It keeps an overall quite neutral presentation and objectively performs pretty well to boot, but I just can't help but feel that for this much money, lacking raw detail retrieval when putting it side by side with significantly cheaper amplifiers is a bit of a shame. In fact, the Chord Alto, whilst warmer in presentation to a notable degree, as I described in the review for that, it still has extremely incisive treble and great genuine detail retrieval, and it does come out ahead of the Luxman in that regard, even though for timbre the P-100 wins hands down. So whether this amplifier is ideal for you is going to depend on your preferences and the headphones that you're running on it. If you're running something like ZMFs or planars with a more linear bass profile, then it's probably not going to be a great option. Or if you just want a more lively, energetic sound, because it's not going to give you that. But if you want a more laid-back sound that is completely fatigue-free at the expense of a little bit of detail retrieval, and you have headphones that are inherently more dynamic, like an Abyss 1266, that again also don't necessarily mind having their treble just tamed down slightly, this could work really well. The separation performance in the mid-range makes vocal-heavy music and a lot of jazz music on this sound fantastic, so it's a bit of a synergy thing. For me, I don't mind the slight roundedness to the bass, as that was more of a headphone-dependent thing, but I do just wish that it was a little more resolving. The slightly dense-sounding treble presentation gives a refined but not particularly engaging end result, and each time I swapped back to the Bliss or the HM1, it made it apparent that there is a little bit of a veil to this that I really would rather was lifted. This is a really expensive amplifier, and as I mentioned earlier, this is probably the nicest built amplifier I have tested. It's quite clear why this is so expensive, and when I say I don't feel that this is worth the money, it's not because I don't think that the cost is justified in terms of how much it actually costs to develop and build this, but rather that at the end of the day, I want the best resulting sound for my money, and this amp sounds great, but it has drawbacks, and I don't feel that it's an actual upgrade in sound quality overall from many far less expensive options. It could be a little bit tricky to work out what the best possible product for your particular taste is going to be. Reviews are fantastic resources, and all of the reviews on this channel are made possible by Headphones.com. But if you want to be able to buy something and not worry at all about what happens if you don't like it, you should check out Headphones.com for your next audio purchase as well, because with their 365-day return policy, if you buy something and you don't love it, you can just send it back. Or if you want a little bit of help and guidance trying to find the right thing for you, then their helpful support staff, all of whom are audiophiles, will help guide you to the right choice. Or if you want to ask me and other wiggly air enthusiasts anything about amps, DACs, music, gear, anything mentioned in this video, or anything else at all, then come and say hey on the Headphones.com Discord server or the Headphones.com forum, and I and other wiggly air enthusiasts will endeavor to help. Until next time, thanks for watching.